So I'm listening to everything you're saying, and it's eloquent, and you can speak well. But so the one thing you said about us establishing community through liberation. See,
Yes.
what I look at this is, it's difficult, not impossible, for me to humanize a white supremacist because he doesn't view me as human. So I cannot relate to a human element in this person because the base of supremacy means that you are supreme over me in your belief system, that you relegate me to something that is probably non-human. So at that point, we can no longer have a conversation about anything, where I'm coming from, right? Mm-hmm. Because you don't view me as something you view me as something, not someone. Mm-hmm. White supremacy is a community. White supremacy is a tiered system. And I think I believe white supremacy is designed to beguile people into supporting itself. As it goes up higher, the less people are allowed to come. However, the illusion of the grandeur that sits up at the top, it's like, okay, I can be adjacent to this. Yeah. You used congruency earlier. There's something in here that I recognize in myself. And if I buy into this Ponzi scheme of white supremacy, I too can sit up top with the masters that you were saying. So to take this into a biological or epidemiological scale, since you're talking about vaccinations, there are people who are vaccine resistant, right? We've seen this. And there are some people who are not just vaccine resistant, but cellular different. They can mutate, modify, move past a vaccine to have something more aggressive form in the presence of something that was already there, right? White supremacy, to me, is something that's intrinsic, it's genetic, it's hereditary. I don't feel like it's something that you can just vaccinate out, because I think that's why you use the word vaccine and not cure.
Yes, and I should note, too, when we think about white supremacy, any system, part of the understanding is we're socialized into it, right? And so in the sense that you can see evidence of young folks who grew up in environments where they might be exposed to parents, who are deeply multicultural or really focused on aspects of equity, and that's their sort of purview. And then there are folks who are born in environments where, they grow up around a lot of biased folks, and they might take on those behaviors. And so in that sense, again, it's all learned behavior, right? Human beings are often born as blank slates, and then we learn how to interact with each other based on the folks around us. And so, again, if no one's actively learning how to live in a thriving world across differences, if no one is learning about the systems that are perpetuating, the supremacy of certain groups over others, then most folks are never armed with the sort of capacity or even with the interest of affecting change, right? Which means we have to be intentional about changing that.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And so the question is, I guess, that becomes because it seems like with this, the concept of systematic oppression is being glossed over. As we look at like a 400-year, what Dante D. King said on the show is like a psychopathic obsession of the genocide of black people that's rooted in these systemic policies that extends beyond policy. It goes into legislation. Yes. It goes into a belief system. It goes into doctrine. It goes into media. It goes into all these different things that exist and permeate through all aspects of the culture that we have to live with. And we haven't even begun to reconcile or unravel before we can get into a conversation of vaccinating something. Yes. So we're looking at people who have had a vested interest over almost a millennia of oppressing black African people on North American soil. And to rectify that by something is saying, okay, I have a training that can eliminate this, or at least begin to do the work to put us on the pathway to eliminate this train of thought or this doctrine, this belief, however you want to phrase it. It seems like you're moving past the fact that systemic oppression is still the number one thing that we're fighting against here.
No, if you look at the site, the very first sort of module that we engage people in, once we break down the consciousness framework, is understanding what it means to recognize racial oppression, right? And so we talk. I'm
on it right now. So I'm about to read while you talk.
Exactly. And so part of what we tell folks is that, again, to understand systemic racism, we have to adopt systemic practices, behaviors. Right? Again, most of us have never been socialized to recognize racial oppression on an ideological, institutional, interpersonal, or individual
Now, when you
level.
mean most of us, are you talking about white people or black people or yes?
Everybody. I mean, I think everybody. Again, you can go into any hood right now and say, hey, can you break down racism on an ideological, institutional, or interpersonal, individual level? What are you talking about?
So they might not be able to break it down verbally, but they can tell you how it feels.
Oh, for sure. No, don't get me wrong. People experience it, but it's one thing to experience something. It's another to articulate what you're experiencing. And again, too often we are socialized to believe that racism is primarily overt acts of hatred or discrimination, right? Which gets people to miss the bigger picture, right? That it goes far beyond that. It's an actual system of how our society is set up, right? It's a system designed to ensure outcomes that are far less for folks of color, particularly black and indigenous folks, than white folks. most folks were never educated on that. And so to the extent that if you were never educated, you have no idea how you might be contributing to it, even with your own sort of belief systems, right? Again, part of what I often reflect on in terms of data is the sort of differences that we see between African Americans and Africans in America in terms of how they understand or engage sometimes opportunity. We see very distinctly that if you are raised into society, particularly as a black person, that it's much easier to adopt certain traits and beliefs about yourself or black people in general versus if you might come from a different country. And so when you look at educational data, for example, right, a lot of folks are surprised to find out that some of the most educated Americans are Indian Americans and Nigerian Americans, right? Mm-hmm. Folks who often come in and have not had to deal with the ideology blasting them in the head time and time again about their lesser than. A lot of Africans in America who come here don't even understand the concept of being lesser than based on race because where they come from, everybody's the same sort of identity, right? And so the idea that they're lesser than, they're less capable, or that, in many ways the system, is designed to they don't get that, right? Which means they're less sort of pliable or they're less impacted by the system because in that way they've sort of they've been inoculated. Right, they don't have that sort of.
Is it that they're inoculated, or is it that they have been affected so deeply by white supremacy and colonialism that when they come to the States, they say, "Why aren't these niggas doing the same thing I'm doing?"